This is Judaism Unbound, episode 83, The Exodus. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
Wait a second, Lex Rofberg?
Yeah, it's a good question. Basically, as I think I've mentioned in the past, in future tense, I'm going to get married. I just got married to my wonderful wife, Valerie, and we decided...
Congratulations.
Thank you. And we decided to combine our names, and her last name was Langberg, and my last name was Rofus, and we took the Rof from Rofus and the Berg from Langberg, and we combined to make Rofberg. So there's lots of layers and interesting reasons why we came to that conclusion that maybe we'll come back to at some point. But for the time being, that's sort of how this went down. And now I am Lex Rofberg for now and the future, both on Judaism Unbound and everywhere else.
Well, we have some other exciting news today, which is that our guest for the episode is Professor Richard Elliott Friedman. You may remember him from episode 27, where he discussed his book with us, Who Wrote the Bible? And we really got deeply into the questions of modern biblical scholarship and what that might have to do with our understanding of what Judaism is all about, what it could be all about, what are the materials that have gone into the shaping of Judaism in the past, and what materials might go into the shaping of Judaism in the future. We're really excited to have Professor Friedman back on today because he's got a new book out. So before we talk about the new book, let me just remind you that Professor Richard Elliott Friedman is the Ann and J. Davis Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Georgia, and he is also the Katzen Professor of Jewish Civilization Emeritus of the University of California, San Diego. And he's written a lot of really great books translating the findings of modern biblical scholarship for contemporary audiences. His books include Who Wrote the Bible? And The Bible with Sources Revealed, that helps you see the different documents that were put together to become the Bible that we know. He's also written his own commentary on the Torah. And his most recent book is called The Exodus: How It Happened and Why It Matters, which just was published a few days ago. And we are really excited to get into the meat of that book on today's episode and to think about whether and how the Exodus may have happened might have implications for the way that we think about Judaism today. So we're so excited to welcome Professor Richard Elliott Friedman back to Judaism Unbound. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be back. I must have done something right the first time.
Well, you keep publishing books, we'll keep having you on.
Okay.
So your most recent book, The Exodus: How It Happened and Why It Matters. I guess we wanted to, obviously we want our listeners to go out and read the book. So what we're hoping is that we can just have a little bit of a conversation for sure about the how it happened part, but we definitely want to leave some mystery there, but definitely a lot of also the why it matters, which is really core to our interest on this podcast. But let's start with the how it happened. Could you just give us a little bit of a taste of what is the question that you're trying to address in the book, and then how do you go about addressing it?
Look, as we all know, a lot of people say the Exodus didn't happen. Probably most of my colleagues in archaeology and many of my colleagues in Bible studies say it didn't happen at all. Others will say it happened, but not the way it's told in the Bible. And you go, well, what's that supposed to mean? It happened, but not the way it's told in the Bible. Oh, my God, you mean the sun didn't really go out for 3 days? The sticks didn't really become snakes? I mean, what are we talking about? So that's sort of like a safe answer that's no answer. And most of the arguments, nearly all of those against it, are arguments that have to do with the great numbers involved. I say, well, if there were really 2 million people in the Sinai for 40 years, we should have at least found a piece of petrified wood that says Moses loved Zipporah on it or something, by now. And we haven't. And they always say we've combed the Sinai and haven't found anything. And an Israeli colleague of mine laughed at that. An archaeologist, he said, nobody's combed the Sinai. He said it was 5 jeeps. It was a survey of the Sinai, not combing the Sinai. But the argument still is valid, I would say. If there really were 2 million people, and it really was for 40 years, we probably should have gotten something. The argument that, well, there's nothing in all the Egyptian records of some mass of people leaving, and nobody called Israel being there as slaves for a long time and staying or going or any of that. And the third piece of that is that we say, well, look at early Israel in its first centuries. there should be a lot of material culture that looks Egyptian there if they'd spent all that time in Egypt. So all those people, the architecture or the pottery or something. And we don't get that either. But none of those are arguments about whether the Exodus happened or not. Those are arguments about whether it was big or not. If they want to say, okay, therefore we reject the idea there was 2 million people, okay, done. Let's give them that. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Back in 1987, and Who Wrote the Bible, I said, well, maybe it was one group. Maybe I suggested it was the Levites, because practically everybody I know in the field agrees that there were people from Western Asia, from the region that is Israel and its neighbors, going down to Egypt and coming back, coming and going for about 400 years, which, as it happens, is the amount of time the Bible says. And they were coming and going all the time, just not in one big exodus. They were, we scholars use the technical term, there were many exoditos that they made. So there were, call them Semites, Levantines, people from that region coming and going from Egypt all the time, but just in smaller groups. And they were free to come and go. Nobody denies that. I proposed that, well, then maybe the smaller group we're looking at could be just the Levites. And then it's a matter of collecting the evidence. In this new book, The Exodus, I listed 10 separate categories of evidence, some collected by me, some by colleagues in the field, some archaeological, some textual, putting the whole thing together that points to the likelihood that it was the Levites. People often make the point that there are Israelites in the Bible who have Egyptian names. Names is a big deal. We in North America, we get that. So there are these people in the Bible that have Egyptian names, most notably, of course, Moses, but two people named Phineas and Hophni and Merari and Mushi. We see that, but the thing about it is, if you look, there are 8 Egyptian names in the Hebrew Bible, and every one of them is a Levite. So everyone who has Egyptian names are Levites, and all the rest of Israel, there's not one Egyptian name. And you say, well, what else do you have to go with that? You go like, well, what are our oldest sources on this? The 2 oldest things in the Bible are the Song of Miriam, also called the Song of the Sea, and the Song of Deborah. In the Song of the Sea, the funny thing is that it gives no indication of what size. It never suggests how big or small the group was that left Egypt. But the most interesting thing is it never mentions the word Israel. It never says that Israel was the people. It just says there was an Am. And then that Am, where did they go? They go to the Mikdash, they go to the Holy Mountain, they go to God's throne platform, only to like the sacred place. Nothing to suggest that they went to the whole land or were the people of the whole land. And meanwhile, the Song of Deborah, the other oldest thing in the Hebrew Bible, it's really close to the event. It celebrates the battle in which Israel first achieved hegemony over the Canaanites, led by Deborah. And in that, Deborah summons the 10 tribes of northern Israel. And the notable thing is that Levi isn't mentioned there, which means either it's because they were in Egypt or on the road, or else because as priests, they wouldn't be reckoned among the tribes being summoned maybe anyway. Actually, you read the book, you find the answer turns out to be a bit of both. But you put those 2 together and you get the Song of the Sea in Egypt never mentions Israel. The Song of Deborah in Israel never mentioned the Levites. That's interesting. And so you have stuff like that. You have that in the Levite texts in the Torah, they emphasize that you have to have circumcision. Circumcision was an Egyptian custom. They have in the priestly texts of the Torah, there's more about the tabernacle than about anything else in the entire Torah. And Professor Michael Homan, who's at Xavier in New Orleans, established that the tabernacle in the Torah is architecturally a match of the battle tent of Ramses II, the Pharaoh of Egypt. Now, how did that happen? And Scott Nogel, a professor at the University of Washington, shows that the ark is modeled on the barks of Egypt. A bark is a boat, but they never put them in the water. They carried them on sticks by priests in parades with a shrine on the top of it that was covered in gold and that had wings on the top. I mean, again, the parallels with our ark are amazing. So all those people say there's no Egyptian material culture in early Israel. They're right if they're speaking about all of Israel. But in fact, the Levites do have all of that Egyptian culture, including their Egyptian names.
You mentioned at the beginning that there are lots of folks out there who doubt whether an exodus happened, and you talked about the size. And I think you really beautifully talked about how you would critique their stances. I've read, and I am no scholar in a deep way of these materials, but I've familiarized myself with some of these different arguments. And where I am for the time being, and maybe you can shift me on this, is that I'm more convinced by the skeptics than those who are defending the existence of an exodus. But I'm coming at this really willing to be moved and challenged by you. And so I guess what I'd love to hear a little more about is what you alluded to in terms of the pieces that are not just within the text, within the Bible. I think a lot about what a teacher of mine talked about in terms of minimalism and maximalism were the terms he used in terms of how different scholars approach the Bible, with minimalism in his terminology referring to people who are basically, they approach the question of, is a particular event historical, from a place of, well, it's probably not historical in the Bible until proven otherwise, until we have a really convincing archaeological find that demonstrates that it might be. And then there's people that approach it differently who say, well, so as I interpreted part of what you said before, why would people make up X? Like, we don't need to necessarily be so skeptical on everything. There could be moments in the Bible where if something is mentioned enough times, or if there's particular framings, we can say, this probably did happen. And ultimately, this is a field where we're never going to know for sure. We don't have the time machine yet. But I understand and empathize with both ways of seeing it. But what I would love to hear more about is the extra biblical evidence, because I'm very intrigued by what you said about like the Levitical names relating to Egyptian names, but I want to hear more about this, what you said about the Mishkan was modeled after an Egyptian space of some sort. And I guess I'd love to hear more about the work that's been done on that, because still we're working with evidence of Egyptian materials that I'm assuming that we have. And then we're saying because the text of the Bible talks about them in a similar way, maybe it's similar dimensions or similar style, I'm not sure, that we might be able to reasonably conclude that there's a parallel there, but we still don't have the actual, as you said, the Moses and Zipporah love each other text, of course, and maybe we don't need it. But I'd love to hear more. Just what are some of those pieces that aren't the text of the Bible that help us to argue on behalf of some form of smaller exodus happening?
All right. Well, first, let me start with the premise. There's somebody who recently wrote a piece saying we're all minimalists, and if we really meant minimalists in a respectable way with a small m, then I am too. Then we're all minimalists, meaning we should all look for evidence. But and you don't start with assumptions of this or that. You just look for the evidence and see where it takes you. What's amazing about this is where I say, well, I'm going to bring 10 different categories of evidence. Some of those are linguistic evidence. Some of those are archaeological evidence, like the matter of the ark and like the tabernacle. For the tabernacle, you can just look at a picture. You can just Google right now, battle tent of Ramses II, and bring up the picture and look at it. And then bring up designs of the tabernacle, including ones in my own books. You can just see for yourself, yes, these are done on the same design. If you look at Professor Nogel's articles about the bark and the ark, and you just look at the pictures of the two. One of the key pieces of evidence, ironically, I didn't even know when I started the book. A colleague of mine said, well, what's the genetic evidence? I said, genetic evidence? I don't know anything about mitochondria and all that. I can't do that. But then a lot of people mentioned, a lot of you have probably heard that there's a Kohen gene that crosses different Jewish diaspora communities. It's Ashkenazis and Sephardi's, and we can go back about 3,000 years to common ancestry of the Kohanim. So I said, gee, I wonder, what do we have on the Levites? And the leading person on this is Karl Skorecki, who's a great scientist at the Technion. And so I Skyped with him. And here's what I learned. The same scholars, which is a group from Oxford and Technion, the same group of scholars who determined that there is a common Kohen gene looked to see if there was a common Levi gene. And they were really unhappy and frustrated because they found out there isn't. Levites don't go back the way Kohanim do, even though they pass from father to son, so you should be able to trace through the Y chromosome and get them. But Levites don't match the rest of Israelites, and they don't match Kohanim. Now, that works fine for me because I'm saying the Levites originally were not a tribe. They were these Levantines who were in Egypt. What they have in common is not DNA. What they have in common is history. Whereas Kohanim were one group that broke off from the Levites, and they really are all descended from common ancestors. So if I'm right, what we should have found is no common ancestry among Levites, but definite common ancestry among Kohanim, and that's exactly what the geneticists found. So when you've got genetic evidence, you've got evidence in the ground, you've got textual evidence, you've got linguistic evidence. At what point do you say, well, gee, okay, I'm persuaded. So yes, for this phone call, we should all be minimalists, and we should all say, gee, that's a heck of a lot of evidence. That's all pointing to that there was an exodus, just wasn't all of Israel. Now, a lot of people won't be happy with that if it's not that every one of us is descended from every one of them, that all of Israel were slaves in Egypt, then okay, then this is disappointing for them. For others, this makes sense because we're getting at the real event behind the story. Now, does it ruin your day if the Exodus is historical, but not all of Israel was in it? Doesn't ruin mine. It makes my day.
Is it your belief, and is it something that you've found evidence for, that smaller group, the Levites, were they also slaves or not necessarily?
It's hard to tell. I think some, at least, of them may have been slaves, and others, or maybe they were oppressed. And the word oppression is the word more than slavery. It was probably slaves. Because if you look in the law codes of E and P and D, they all mention slaves and have laws about slaves, mostly that even if you're going to have slaves, you have to treat them right. There are all these laws, well-known laws of the Torah that have rules about slavery. So there's evidence that, it's the Levites who have the experience of having been slaves. Do I get to turn this around, though? If you say, well, okay, you need to prove that the Exodus happened, but otherwise then it didn't happen. But no, what are the evidence? What's the arguments that it didn't?
I'm not the person to answer that most effectively, but I think the answer gets back to that. Everybody agrees, I think, about two premises. One is that there needs to be some level of evidence to claim that any event historically happened. And the other premise is that there is a threshold at which you decide, well, this is enough evidence, even though we can never really have 100% evidence. And once that threshold is reached, I think we all agree that you then say that an event happened. And I think where the debate is where that threshold is. It's where the level of evidence is and what kinds of evidence need to be present in order to make that determination. And I'm not the person to make the best argument for why the threshold has not been reached. I think you've put out a great argument for why it has been. But I really am curious to hear the second piece of the second piece of the puzzle, which is the why does it matter? Because I remember when we had you on in the past, you spoke about that it really does matter to you. Some people you've heard say that it's not important if it happened or not. It's just it's a story, whatever. And that's certainly how I have occasionally spoken about it. Like, the point for me isn't that the Exodus happened or not. It's that we have this amazing model and story or myth or whatever the right term is that we can learn from and apply to our lives today in a variety of ways. And that's how I've framed it. But you gave, I think, a compelling set of reasons why we really should care.
Okay, sure. Well, the alien part, obviously, if you, that's really the culmination of the book. And I certainly didn't mean it when I wrote the book in terms of current politics in the United States where there's issues of aliens at this very moment. I had all of this and was lecturing about it and writing about it prior to the current political state of things. I've been working on this for a couple of years. But the relevance of it is just so clear that a principle was established that far back, and only in Israel that far back, that you treat aliens the same as citizens. And that's the law in the United States, too. I mean, we didn't get that out of nowhere in our country, that if a Frenchman comes to the United States and he gets sued by a Native American and they both go to court, the judge and the jury have to treat the Frenchman and the American the same. And if the Frenchman commits a crime, he has to go on trial for it, but he can have a lawyer and a jury and a trial the same as I can. And that's tremendous. That principle didn't come out of nowhere. And we can treasure it more if we know that it came out of not out of nowhere, but as part of our people's whole being. Once a culture has been thinking about something for 3,000 years, it's very deeply embedded in that culture. And monotheism, likewise, not everybody has to be a monotheist. You can be a polytheist, an atheist, an agnostic, or whatever, but you have to recognize that monotheism played this significant role, for good or bad. It played the significant role in this human adventure on Earth for the last 3,000 years, roughly, 2.5 to 3. And that started with this.
I'm thinking about an analogy to the United States and the question of if we look at the United States Constitution, for example, and subsequent history, obviously there are a lot of terrible things too, but if we look at some of the themes that we're most proud of, religious freedom, for example, does it make it more powerful because we know that there was a small subgroup of those who sort of were part of the founding of America, who were the Puritans who were fleeing from religious persecution in Europe? Or would that Constitution, the First Amendment, be as powerful either way? And my understanding of your claim, is that it makes it more powerful to know that it has this anchoring in a historical event. And I'm wondering if you could bring out a little bit more about why you feel that way.
Any idea onto which we latch works better for us and is understood better by us if we see how it developed and where it came from. If you say Freud came up with the notion of the Oedipal conflict between men and their fathers, and then you find out that every time Freud went to the cemetery to try to visit his father's grave, he passed out. And that helped him think of all this, If you say, the Oedipal complex, gee, that's really an interesting thing. Whether you think it's right or wrong, it's right psychologically. But then you go, wow, Greeks thought of that like in a play they wrote 2,500 years ago. And they just put it up there on the stage. A guy kills his father and marries his mother. How can that be not interesting and not meaningful to understand this has been a deep part of us for that far back?
The way that what you're saying sort of really speaks to me is, I sort of think a lot about, and it's definitely in the air today, what is the right way, for example, what is the right way to think about the Holocaust? Is that there are two legitimate responses to the fact that the Jews were persecuted, and killed in such large numbers in the Holocaust, Number one is, I'm never going to let this happen to me ever again. So I'm going to become strong and powerful and over careful, et cetera, et cetera. And the other is that I'm going to develop a deep ethic where I make sure that I'm the voice in the world that makes sure that this never, ever happens again to others. And if the Exodus, as you describe it, is real, and there was a real group of people that was going through a terrible oppression, and they came out of it having made the decision that what we're going to do is, create a culture that stands for Proposition 2, That the meaning of our suffering was that we should make sure this never ever happens again to others in the same position. Then, in a sense, we have a cultural history of choosing option 2 as our response to oppression. And that makes me feel very happy. That also makes me feel that my attitude about how I understand the Holocaust is sort of part of our cultural tradition, That makes me feel, also I've talked about this before. I think that earlier when I was a lawyer, I worked for equal rights for same-sex marriage, for example. And I very much saw that as a continuation of my father's work in the civil rights movement, and he very much saw that as a response to the Holocaust, right? And I sort of like that idea that this is a deep fact of Jewish history from the beginning, and I do think that there's a way in which there's an extra power to saying we had an ancestor that could have decided to go in direction 1, but instead chose to go in direction 2. And that is the core of what this has been about for the last 3,000 years, as opposed to, right, we had an ancestor who wrote a book where he or she advocated for option 2, and we are the people of that book. That's also great, but it does feel a little bit less resonant.
Well, I think what you just said was phenomenal. I'm going to call back my book and put it in. I mean, an analogy to how people react to the Holocaust, right? That we said, we know how it feels. And it'll be a shame if, generations from now, Jews still feel those good ways, but they don't know that how much of it came from the experience of the Holocaust. And likewise, it would be a shame if we know now, that we care about aliens and what we feel about history writing or monotheism, and it'd be a shame that we've lost where it came from. And this is an attempt to give it back. I pulled the dirty trick before saying, well, what's the evidence that there wasn't an Exodus? I didn't really expect either of you to have to do that. But your answer was perfect about well, you have to reach a certain threshold in evidence when you accept something. And either this book of mine finally hits that threshold, which we have, in fact, never hit before, or I failed. It'll just be, people will judge it, colleagues, archaeologists, biblical scholars, will argue it out, we'll test the evidence. But if it does turn out that way, that we have reached the point where there's sufficient evidence to say, we don't know exactly what happened, but we know something did in fact happen, then we reap all these benefits from it.
I really appreciate the way you framed this, and I want to come back to the question you asked today and in the past about would it ruin your day if you woke up tomorrow morning and it turned out that the Exodus did happen, but that the Exodus did happen, but it was much smaller, for example. And where I come at it from, actually, and maybe this is a small minority, but I figure I'll put it out there and just see what you think. For me, I actually would have my day ruined tomorrow if I woke up and found out that the Exodus did happen in either in the large sense or in a smaller group sense, like the Levites tomorrow. And I bring that bias to my analysis of this, and I'm very aware of that. But I think it's important to name that because the reason that I would have my day ruined is because I look at some of the dangers that are present when we have certain kinds of inherited history. A friend of mine is doing a documentary right now that I'm really excited to watch about two different societies. He's comparing and contrasting Germany and Britain and how they relate to their own histories in the 20th and 19th centuries and their own devastating atrocities that they've caused to other groups. And what he talks about is that Germany has owned in a very big way. Maybe they could do more, but they owned within the first couple decades after the Holocaust, after World War II, they owned the atrocities. I mean, people know about reparations, etc. Britain has not, in as many sort of tangible ways, owned its colonialist history. And my friend's doing a documentary about the ramifications of that. And what I'm thinking about is if I woke up tomorrow and there was defining proof that the Exodus happened, my read on human nature is that people would feel a deep need to defend their own ancestors and say, okay, so we have all these stories about what our ancestors did in these books. And I'll be real. I think a lot of what our either literal or mythical ancestors did in the Bible did. I think a lot of what they did was terrible. And I think we're probably on the same page about that. And I guess I'm just worried about human nature in that I think people like to see their own family histories, their own ancestral heritage as positive. And we would start to veer into apologetics. And I've seen this historically. I think Midrash is a great example of this. We tend to say, okay, Aaron, Moses, et cetera, the centralized characters, they did all sorts of good things. And the people that were on the other sides of the stories, Korach, et cetera, they were wrong. And that's what the rabbis did over and over again. And I love in our contemporary world where people say, you know what? What if Korach was right? What if maybe Balaam, who is demonized in later text, wasn't so bad? What if, and I think that what if, those sets of alternative thinking are more likely to happen when the story is sort of mythical than if it's really historical, because then we want to defend our own, for lack of a better term, family members or ancestors. And maybe I'm being too cynical. Maybe I should be more generous in my interpretation of human nature. But I thought I'd put it out there because if I'm being honest, my day would be pretty rough tomorrow if I found out that the Exodus did happen, which is very different from, I think, a lot of other people. And I'd love to hear your response or thoughts, etc., on that.
Well, I'm sorry to ruin your day tomorrow, but it did happen, and it is historical. So there you are. I don't get your point, actually, about why that puts you in some position. If the Exodus was historical, that means now you have to defend every bad thing that happens in the Bible, too. I mean, the Bible is this record of, from the earliest thing in the Bible, Song of the Sea, to the latest thing in the Bible, Daniel, is 1,000 years, and most of it is pretty wonderful and great, and there's some things in there that are bad, most of which never happened. I mean, nobody massacred the Canaanites, nobody massacred the Midianites, nobody massacred the Amalekites, and none of those things happened. Those are just stories.
No, sorry, I'm not ashamed. I think other people, and this is my read on what midrashes did. I think many midrashes attempt to rehabilitate those stories that you're referring to in terms of when we wipe out various groups of people. They tend to be finding sort of the reasons why that is permissible. And I think that maybe once again, maybe I'm not being charitable enough. You can totally come at it from an angle that that maybe we've progressed, or I'm just a skeptical guy, and I worry about the demon sides, the Yetzer Hara sides, the evil inclination sides of us.
Well, look, I'm a Torah guy. I am a BCE guy. I always tell people I don't know anything about AD. To me, AD is Jesus, Columbus, Kennedy, Obama. You know, I mean, it goes by. But BC I know, and I know Torah, and that the rabbinic world came and squared the circle of that reality. It's a shame for me as a Bible scholar because I loved the circle the way it was. But Midrash adds a lot of wonderful stories and all, but they're stories. I mean, Midrash is fiction, and what we're talking about here is not fiction. We're talking about history, and the historical impulse is the impulse for truth. And the impulse for truth is you have to tell it no matter what, no matter where it goes. When I was writing Who Wrote the Bible, I went to my teacher, Frank Cross, who was like the great Bible scholar in that generation. He and Elliott Friedman were the two greats. And I said to him, listen, I'm a little worried about this book I'm writing because, some people might be hurt by it. Some people might be upset by it. I'm realizing the possibilities here. And he said to me, you've got to do your thing. And I mean, that's what historians do. Our job is to tell the truth. You know, good for the Germans. Today, they're, as you say, coming to terms with what happened. And other cultures, you're right, haven't. But we can't step back from, I don't know what to make of somebody who would learn, yes, a lot of the Bible is historical. Oh, gee, no, now I have to defend that Joshua killed everybody at Jericho. No, you don't. He didn't. It didn't happen. There, off the hook.
But so can you help us out a little bit with that? Because for example, I really liked one of the things that you brought up in the book, which is one of these things that I hadn't quite thought about in this way before, but of course it makes sense when you do. You talk about the Merneptah stela and how it talks about, which was a sort of a record made by one of the Egyptian pharaohs, Merneptah, in which he claims that he's essentially wiped out Israel. Its seed is no more. And we know that that's not true because Israel existed after that. And so you take that to show that it was kind of a normal thing back then where kings and people would claim that they had wiped out other people for various political reasons or self-aggrandizing reasons, and they hadn't really done it. And so, the implication, right, I think, is when we see those kind of things in the Bible, that it's that probably those things didn't happen when it says that the Israelites wiped someone out. I guess my question there is, do we know that those stories are all fiction, or do we, because or do we essentially hypothesize that we didn't wipe out anyone? I guess the question is, when we look back into history and we try to derive, the elements that we can say that really happened for all the reasons that you and I think agree about, that the value of that. How do we contend with some of the things that probably did happen that we might not feel very good about? Like, for example, right, slaves who didn't want to leave the master, right? I think their ears were pierced in a way that probably wasn't too nice. They're probably right. There are various things that we probably, right, have these elements where we do also have to accept that we came from a culture where there probably were various things happening that would make us feel profoundly uncomfortable. And how do we kind of look back and be strengthened by the positive? Lex has actually talked eloquently about Abraham Joshua Heschel marching in Selma as this deeply significant historical moment, I think, that had a strong educational effect for many Jews about saying what Judaism ought to be all about. But the flip side that Lex has expressed concerns about is, but a lot of people took that as a sort of feeling like, oh, look how great Jews are. They didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to follow Abraham Joshua Heschel's example. They could just be proud that he had done this, and they could go on in their lives doing, not so nice things, but sort of look back and say, hey, look how great our people is. And so how do we kind of balance the search for the true things that are great, and also the recognition of the true things that maybe are not so great?
In each of the cases you just named, and in the case of the conquest, look, all the evidence known to me is that never happened. The destruction layers simply aren't there for the time of Israel's arrival in the land, and there is no arrival of Israel in the land. Israel was just there. And people have used that as evidence against the Exodus to say, well, if the conquest didn't happen, then yeah, the Exodus must be made up too. And it's just the opposite. They needed to make up a conquest because they needed to explain how the heck 2 million people suddenly arrived in the country. So once they accepted the big numbers, they had to invent the conquest too. It argues actually for the idea of the smaller Exodus. Or say the thing about, well, we're hard on a slave who chooses not to go free. We punch a hole in his ear. I don't know. My daughters had holes punched in their ears. Everybody always imagines that it's some big, thick screw or something that they're doing. And it says you do it at the door, so they assume that they're making it go through your ear and they're attaching you to the door. People make such a mess of that particular example. But at the same time, I'm not going to say, nothing bad ever happened in the Bible. I'm just saying all the most famous cases, the ones people always draw, are actually the most questionable ones. Moses has the massacre of the Midianites, including all the Midianite women, if they're virgins and all. Well, that story is only written in the latest source, an eastly source, which happened 400 years after the Midianite League had ceased to exist. It's a polemical story against Moses for having a Midianite wife. But I don't try to clean up the Bible and clean every bad thing that's in there. And you could even say if these stories aren't historical, still they're in there and people have taken them as historical, so they may have inspired violence. So there's no reason to lie and clean up everything that we don't like in the Bible. There are things we don't like. But what I said in the book, at least, is if we're going to do that, if we're going to cherry pick all the cases in the Bible where there's something negative, then we can do that as long as we acknowledge at the time that what we're doing is cherry picking. Yes, accept the bad. Don't sweep it under the carpet. Acknowledge it. But I understand when you're doing that. But yes, these are some bad things in the context of a good book.
So first of all, I really want to say because we've disagreed, or at least you and I have disagreed to some extent in here, that I really, really cherish and value being able to have this conversation. And I hope the listeners out there, wherever they are on the Exodus question, find somebody who sees it differently and can engage with it like this. But so as we think about this a little more in terms of how we apply it to our lives today, I'm thinking back to what you said about the monotheism point, about how how there seems to be a pretty good indication that Israel was the first or one of the first groups that embraced monotheism on some level. And I guess I'm thinking, because Dan and I have spoken about this a little bit, we have a set of issues in contemporary Jewish life where more and more people either identify themselves as atheists or as at least agnostics, or maybe they're not even sort of on that spectrum. It's just they're not really engaging with the question of God. If you were taking this text and talking about the contributions of Israelites or Jews, as you put it, you're a BCE guy, in BCE, in a space where perhaps a lot of people are not theists, how would you look to communicate that in a way that both empowers those who do believe in God and for whom that's an important part of how they operate and they see that as part of their Jewish identity, and those who don't, but are still looking to live in this civilization or group or people known as the Jews?
I know Jews of every kind, and some believe in God and some don't, and some are agnostic. People say that the real truth is that we're all agnostics because we don't really know. Or there's the old line, in the medieval times in the church, they would say, what is the difference between the bishop and the atheist? And it was the bishop believes during the day, but he doubts at night. And the atheist doubts during the day, but he believes at night. For most Jews, it's more important how you live and some of the other things we talk about, how you treat aliens. You can tell the story of God in the Bible, no matter what. God is one of the major players in the story. There's two major characters in the dynamic of the Bible, which is God and Israel. But I've now been teaching for 41 years, and I don't believe I have a student who knows if I believe in God or not.
In closing, I'm just wondering if you could give us some of your thoughts on what you would like to see as the way that, let's say, regular Jews, regular non-Jews, kind of look at that strange intermixture of the original texts, the traditional ways that they've been looked at, and then the kind of, maybe and the academic ways, and putting them all together, because it's funny, how you initially, right, put the question, would it ruin your day to learn that the Exodus wasn't 2 million people? And we know there are a lot of people, certainly throughout history, whose days would have been ruined by learning that, right? Who fundamentally say, if it's not the way that the Bible says it, then it lacks meaning. It can't be, it's either it's right, the Bible is true, or the Bible is not true. And on the flip side is that question, maybe it's Lex, it's like, would it ruin your day to learn that a piece of it is true and actually an important piece? And yeah, it would ruin their day because they actually see it also as a whole and say, gee, it makes me feel better to know that this is a story, because I know that stories can be flawed and stories can be made up by fallible people, but history, well, that's true, and it would actually bother me if these were the lessons that people learn from true events. And how might we sort of look at all this and say, look, there are ways in which we should care and we should drive to try to understand the true history and make meaning of it. And there are ways in which, we can also accept that history from a long, long time ago has its limitations in terms of its importance to our day.
What can I say? Why can't we love both? The history and the story. I mean, the world did not begin with two naked people, a talking snake, and a magic tree. That didn't happen. There was an Exodus. That did happen. They're both magnificent. And we've latched onto both, and appreciate both and get something different out of each. I'm working now on a television series with my partner, John Buffalo Mailer. John Buffalo Mailer is the son of Norman Mailer. Norman Mailer is the only person to win Pulitzer Prizes both in fiction and in nonfiction. he appreciated both, and he could do both well. And I'm sure his son is proud of his father that he could do both well. Well, we can be proud of our fathers, that we did both well. The Garden of Eden story is magnificent. It's an exquisite story as it's constructed. And the Exodus is a magnificent piece of history. It changed our lives and also has a great story around it. And I hope I'm not dodging your question, but on the contrary, answering it directly when I say, how much I love both and feel like honored to be an heir of both of those, and to have been the heir of it as it happens, not just through Jews, because I did my doctorate entirely under Christians, that all the world now are the heirs of both this history and this fiction. Elie Wiesel has at the beginning of one of his books the line, God loves the Jews because they tell such good stories. And when he tells that, he doesn't distinguish between whether the story's true or not.
Thank you so much, Richard Elliott Friedman, for joining us again on Judaism Unbound. It's been a really fun conversation.
Thank you.
And on that note, we are going to close out this episode. As we do so, we're going to encourage all of you out there, our listeners, to be in touch with us, as we like to do every episode. And there are a few ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can check out our website, judaismunbound.com, which has show notes for this episode and for all of our others. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email at dan@nextjewishfuture.org or lex@nextjewishfuture.org. The last plug we like to make is that you can always support us financially with either a one-time monetary gift or a monthly recurring donation. And if you'd like to do that, you can do so at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.